To give our musicians fair warning, I outlined my sermon several weeks or months in advance. So we already know, the three of us already know, that 3 weeks from today I'll be talking about the fluid and often deceptive and fact-challenged nature of political speech. And I don't want to get into that topic too deeply before that sermon rolls around 3 weeks from today. But I have to confess that Ben Carson is testing my resolve. There's bound to be a lot of grist for the mill the day that sermon does show up at the end of this month. But today I want to explore something of Bishop Spong's articulated vision for the future of the church. That is, the hope that there might be a religious consciousness that will arise from the myths, the superstition, the spiritual instincts of more primitive times that would preserve a religious consciousness that is relevant to modern life, that simultaneously is concerned about social justice and the environment, while also finding a deep and passionate wonder and awe at the complexity, the mystery, and the beauty of existence itself. And that sense of awe, that surprise and shock to the soul could lead us to connection within community that is defined by deeper and lasting friendships, deeper loves, and more meaningful ties to one another. Our friends, Bishop Spong, Dr. Charles Hedrick, Dr. David Trobish, Dr. Teresa Hornsby, and I'll include myself in that list, as well as many of our other favorite authors, Marcus Borg, Karen Armstrong, and others. We all grew up in religious environments in which we were expected to take biblical narratives as being not just morally powerful, but historically accurate, that they were normative, that they were even necessary for both our happiness and our survival, especially in the eternal sense, that buying into those myths and stories was necessary for us to be okay on the other side of the grave. Every single one of us, all these people I named, every single one of us went away to graduate school not to debunk our ancient faith, but to build upon a foundation that would allow us to become teachers of that faith, leaders within the structures of the church. None of us were happy to discover that the intellectual and factual integrity of that whole body of church teachings and assumptions about ancient scriptures were not only unreliable, but they were, in very complex ways, sometimes even not just factually mistaken, but they were psychologically dangerous, hazardous. There's a very high dropout rate in the more academically credible seminaries all over the world. I started at Vanderbilt Divinity School in 1979, and there were 64 or 5 students in my starting class, and 17 of us graduated. That's how high the dropout rate was. And among those who graduated, very few stayed in ministry very long. In my doctoral program, there were about 25 of us, and to the best of my knowledge, I was the only one that finished. People do not want to have their bubbles burst. People who want to hold on to magical thinking, some of whom will either, I can tell you from my graduate school experience that when people began to feel their confidence being challenged, that some would burst into angry outbursts. Others would just dissolve into miserable tears because they found reality threatening and undesirable. What stood at the doorstep of our decision to start this particular church was the awareness that there is and there has been for far too long, for more than a century, a huge gulf between what is good scholarship, what goes on in the classrooms of institutions of higher learning, graduate schools of religion, and the better seminaries, and what goes on in the pews. There's just this huge gap between the two, and that we wanted to bring the two together and stop letting people get these educations and then go into churches asking them to assassinate their brains and invest themselves in misinformation, bad moral guidance, long outdated views of gender, race, class, sexual orientation, and my friends, even their views of God, the God of eternity. I will credit my friend Michael Dowd with coining the phrase of evidence-based or fact-based faith. The religious consciousness that Bishop Spong has talked about hoping to see arise within the churches cannot come into existence through the fog of sloppy thinking. The kind of consciousness, spiritual, religious consciousness that he describes cannot exist in the presence of belief in magic and superstition that has defined past generations of the church. The people who literally ran screaming from the classes I attended at Vanderbilt 35 years ago were confronted with realities that they didn't want to think about. They didn't want to know it. They didn't want to allow these bits of information to affect their magical thinking. But I would argue that they would always have to know. They may have left seminary. They may have dropped out. They may have gone back to traditional church. But they would always know that they were denying reality when they did it. They could never escape the fact that they were dismissing the real world in favor of an imaginary world. But if I may pick up the thread of my earlier comment, what we have seen this week in Ben Carson's dogged insistence that he made a comment in a speech that he was giving in a religious college, and he comes from a Seventh-day Adventist background, and so he was giving either a commencement or baccalaureate speech at a religious college where it's kind of safe to say kind of crazy things. But he said that his own conviction was that Joseph had built the pyramids in Egypt in order to store grain for the 7 years of famine that Joseph had predicted. He has gone so far as to say that only progressives who are atheists would find this statement to be absurd. And he's still defending it. I mean, it's one thing to have a video clip and say, well, I was kind of talking off the top of my head. I probably shouldn't have said that. I can't really back that up. But instead, he is defending that and suggesting that if you don't believe it, that maybe there's something wrong with you. My good friend, Bill Ringo, with whom I go scuba diving every year, is in fact a rocket scientist. He has a PhD from a NASA program, and he's been gloating this week that now being a rocket scientist stands alone as the proverbial reference for intelligence, since Ben Carson has single-handedly made saying, well, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to mean anything at all. That is no longer a high mark for being smart. So now it doesn't take a rocket scientist is the only measure that we have for great intelligence. You cannot argue that someone who is a scientist and yet insists that the world is no more than 6,000 years old, that evolution is a deception created by Satan himself, and that the patriarch Joseph built the pyramids to serve as grain storage barns isn't going to be troubling. Carson may have had technical success in the operating room, but his orientation to reality and his ability to do critical thinking simply doesn't show up on the radar. There is something seriously wrong with this guy. Yet even in the face of what must be thought of as public humiliation, a significant percentage of our friends and neighbors here in the Ozark still want this man to be president. And again, I don't want to focus on this today because I'm doing political speech 3 weeks from now, and I want to save something for that. But I lift it up today as a litmus test for religious thinking, not for political speech, but for religious thinking. Of those who have been willing to discuss their decision to continue to support Ben Carson's candidacy in light of these anti-scientific, anti-historical, and even anti-biblical scholarship statements. I mean, I got to tell you, if you wrote that in a seminary paper and turned it in, you would get an F for that. It's just too sloppy to actually defend. But about half of the people who still support Ben Carson, and by the way, since he has been exposed for this and other things, he's raised an astonishing amount of money in political donations. And of the people who are donating that are literally excited by the controversy created around this, about half of them say that they just don't care, that it's a media-created fracas and that they just don't care. The other half say that they think he might be right, that there's just that many people in our society who are willing to say that facts, good thinking skills, information just really doesn't matter to them, that it just isn't important. Now, I lead a fairly homogenized life, and I want to thank you all for that. In spite of living in what has to be one of the most conservative communities in America, my day-to-day contact is almost exclusively with people who have like-minded views of the world. I just don't get exposed to a lot of the right-wing crazies. I'm sufficiently outspoken and substantially published in such a way that any residual family members or friends who take radically different views stopped talking to me years ago. So I just don't have much contact with that. But my morning habit of drinking coffee, sitting up in bed, and yelling at Joe Scarborough on Morning Joe, my multitasking issue is that I play a kind of Scrabble game online with other people that live in the community. And one of my regular opponents is a local teacher, a conservative Christian with several children and a baby daddy in prison. And our sidebar conversations are as close as I get to a heated debate with any religious conservatives these days. She is devoted to the form of Christian faith that you have often heard me call magic and superstition. She is also a big Ben Carson supporter. Though there are multiple video clips of Ben Carson saying in public that he believed that Joseph built the pyramids, that Satan is the author of the theory of evolution, and the earth is no more than 6,000 years old, she believes that all of those things are media deceptions. Paradoxically, she also says, and he might be right. So I'm not sure where she's really falling down on this, but this is a college-educated public school teacher, and your children might be in her classroom. Why is it taking Americans so long to switch from burning coal and generating electricity from nuclear power plants to transition into renewable forms of energy? Because a large part of our population has been taught not to believe in facts, not to be troubled by reality, but to engage in preference, that they do politics, philosophy, religion, and science by their personal preference and not based on information. Why is it so difficult to curb our military budget that feeds the transfer of wealth from the poor and the middle class to the top 0.1% in our economy? Because people in our country have been trained to react out of fear and have confused fear with patriotism rather than facts and reality. Even now, and I don't want to offend anybody who's in the military or has family in the military, but to say defending our freedom, who has threatened our freedom in the last 50 years? Who? And yet we keep describing every war that we engage in to control the natural resources of another country as defending our freedom. We might be defending gasoline prices. We might be defending our control of trade routes, but we're sure not defending our freedom. And you have to admit, specifically religious training is often the foundation of magical thinking that is a part of every other social problem that we seem to find it difficult to rationally address. As the French philosopher Voltaire said, those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Once you are willing to disengage from reality and to say that you believe in things that cannot be in any way rationally defended, then you can just say, you put up a drawing of a mobile weapons of mass destruction lab that no one's ever seen, no one's ever photographed, there is no extant evidence for it other than a cartoon drawing. And on the basis of that, murder 500,000 innocent people because we're afraid and because we're willing to engage in magical thinking. You've heard me quoting Dr. Todd Scheibel in the past. Todd says that any research project should answer the 3 so's. What is so what, and so what should we do? Tell me what is true, tell me why it matters, tell me what I ought to do about it. You can never get a reasonable plan of action if you refuse to take the first step. If you refuse to acknowledge what is so, or if we're willing to willy-nilly mix fact with imagination, wishful thinking, and a bit of magic and superstition, then our subsequent decisions about what we're going to do, what our national policy is, what our church is going to teach, how we're going to live our lives, none of that will make sense if we are unwilling to engage in what is substantively true. Now, several of our church members joined me Thursday evening at Missouri State University for a lecture by Geraldo Marti, a sociologist on religion. And he was talking about the emerging church movement, and an obvious topic of interest to us because though that word emerging oftentimes gets interpreted in lots of different ways, we are in a way an emerging church in the sense that we are emerging from the ashes of fallen apart denominational institutions. I went to hear what he thought was going to happen. And true to a sociologist, he didn't make any predictions. He just talked about what he has observed about how the church has evolved to move away from traditional structures of established denominations. And in a lot of ways, those of us that were there kept looking at each other and saying, well, he's describing us, he's describing how we started and how we have evolved and changed through the years, though he didn't make any predictions. But there were a couple of points where I really disagreed with him, at least to the degree that he was, what he was saying applied to us. Now, there's no forum for pastors of emerging churches to get together and talk to each other. So I really don't know how true this is of others. But he talked about emerging churches having a very high and generous tolerance for differences in belief, and he implied that beliefs simply don't matter in the emerging church. And you've heard me deliver sermons where I say that behavior is more important than belief, that orthopraxy, what you do, is much more important than orthodoxy, what you believe. But to the sense that we might be tolerant of superstition, magical thinking, imaginary stuff, I don't think we're really very tolerant of that. We are not welcoming to an anti-science, anti-medicine, unreal, and untrue statements of belief. That's the Unitarian Church, if I may say it just that way. I mean, there are churches that declare that they are an umbrella under which people of all faiths can come and stand. We haven't really done that. I remember years ago at Vanderbilt, we had a new dean, and one of the students challenged him to say, why don't we have any evangelicals on staff? If we're an open-minded liberal institution, why don't we have some of both? And he said, we only have professors who have academic legitimacy, which is, and he summed it up saying, we are extremely and intentionally inclusive within the academically credible realm of teaching, which I have to say, I think we are too. We want to be very open-minded and unjudging, but rather ferociously intolerant of stuff that's just silly. And there's just no sense in which you reject traditional orthodoxy and then import a new set of magical beliefs that are just as unsubstantiated and off base as what you had rejected. A great deal of religious history has been deeply invested in deception and in manipulation. And for that, the church writ large, the capital C church, owes the world an apology. And all of us need to work on cleaning up our own mess. Bishop Spong has articulated a vision for the church, for the future of the church, that is an emerging spirituality that honors the earth, that works for justice, that fosters real love, forgiveness, compassion, and meaningful connection between all people. And I don't know if the church really does have a future, but if I'm going to be found in any kind of church in the future, it'll have to be that kind of church. It'll have to be that. Nothing else holds any meaning for me. Both the government and the traditional church have tried to keep you afraid of Muslims, of Arabs, to keep you impoverished through military spending. You have been manipulated by the banks and corporations to be afraid of the Chinese so that we would passively accept this TTP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact, that will enrich the 1% at the expense of all of the rest of us just to keep China from ascending, locking in low wages and unemployment in our nation to prevent the rise of the economic viability of over 1 billion people in China who are also desperately poor and in need of a raise in their standard of living. You have been seduced by TV ads and government misinformation into believing that the only way that we can get around is through gas-burning, individually owned automobiles, and the only way that you can heat and light your house is by burning coal. Those who make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. If the church of the future has anything of value to offer to you, let it be this. Let us offer the courage to stop being manipulated by fear and the wisdom to be devoted to what is true rather than what is imaginary. Because you're not going to go to heaven. You're either going to make this life heaven or we're going to be doomed to a hell of ignorance and injustice. And I'm not going to go there quietly.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.